This episode is brought to you by MeUndies. While MeUndies can't totally help your love life this Valentine's Day, they can offer you insanely comfy undies and loungewear to buy or gift. MeUndies has so many awesome Valentine's Day prints and styles. Plus, you can match with your partner, friends, or even your pets. This Valentine's Day, give the gift that'll keep them thinking of you and score huge site-wide savings at MeUndies.com/Spotify. That's MeUndies.com/Spotify. MeUndies. Comfort from the outside in.
Hey Beat Check listeners, I'm Julia Silverman, and I'm the Oregonian's K-12 education reporter. I spend most of my time thinking about our state's public school system, but schools definitely do not exist in a vacuum. For kids to be ready to learn and grow in school, they need enough food to eat and a safe, stable home. It's an ecosystem, right? Oregon, as anyone who pays rent or is trying to buy a house well knows, has a housing affordability problem. The Oregonian's crackerjack housing and commercial real estate reporter, Jonathan Bach, wrote a story in Sunday's paper about innovative ways the state is trying to tackle this issue and why it's such a heavy lift. Welcome to Beat Check, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me.
Your Sunday story is about the community land trust model. Can you please give our listeners a quick overview of what that is and tell us why it can be a great deal for a homeowner or renter? And I just want to say, heads up, before I read your story, I'd always thought of land trusts as nonprofits that buy and conserve land for habitat and recreation. How little I knew.
Right. So land trusts are definitely used for conservationist aims, just like you described. But the community land trust is a model that's been around for a few decades, and it has its roots back in the sort of civil rights era when a group of folks they were sharecroppers in the South who, in rural Albany, Georgia, who leased their land for their homes and farms, and they sort of lived on the land of white landowners who, according to Tony Pickett, who's the chief executive of this group that I spoke with, Grounded Solutions Network, it's a national community land trust group, he said that these sharecroppers were often evicted from their farms in retaliation for peaceful protests. So a group of civil rights pioneers at the time raised money to go to Israel to study the idea of communal land ownership. They came back and they were inspired to create what we now know as community land trusts. The first one, which was established in Georgia, was at the time among the largest tracts in the U.S. Of land owned by African Americans. Now, this land trust model, community land trust model, gained traction across the U.S. In the ensuing decades as a way to sort of tackle housing affordability in unique and sort of innovative ways, which eventually reached Oregon.
So the idea is homeowners own their home, but not the land underneath it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Exactly.
when they go to sell it, does that mean that, or when they go to sell it, does that mean that they can make less money, but it sort of balances out because they've been able to purchase for less money? Is that right?
The main thrust of the community land trust model, or a main thrust of the community land trust model, is it's sort of a stepping stone into home ownership. So the amount of equity that you can accrue as a community land trust homeowner is limited by sort of a complicated formula, which we get into in the story. But effectively, you can take the money if you're, and this, I should say briefly, is targeted toward low and sometimes middle income homeowners. So you can take the money that you accrue as a homeowner, and let's say after 10 years, a normal number might be like $80,000 that you accrue. You can take that money, and a lot of folks will take that into a market rate house.
Oh, that makes sense. Your story was set in Central Oregon, but it's no secret that Bend is one of the most expensive housing markets in the whole state. Too bad for all of us who have dreamed of giving it all up and running away to Bend, huh?
Right.
What other communities around Oregon are exploring a land trust model?
So the nonprofit that I profiled in this story, Rooted Homes, which has been around for about a decade, um, they consult with other groups around the state. So in Southern Oregon and on the coast, and then obviously in the Portland area, Proud Ground has been around for a long time.
So the model sounds really promising, but I've been around long enough to know there's got to be some kind of a catch. What are some of the challenges involved in scaling this up?
The main challenge, I mean, one of the main challenges that backers will talk about is obviously funding. But an interesting challenge is that it's just a complicated system. It's a complicated way of doing things. And I think that that puts off a lot of private parties that might otherwise sort of get into land trusts. Someone has to oversee the trust, oversee the land in perpetuity because it is sort of a permanent affordability measure. And it's a role that, some private parties might view as cumbersome and overly complex. Um, Another sort of hurdle to scaling up is that, as Tony Pickett, the gentleman that I talked about earlier, said that this, it largely gained traction by word of mouth. So Rooted Homes, the Oregon nonprofit that I mentioned earlier, while they have been around for about a decade, in Bend, they're expecting by the end of this year to have about 60 units in Bend. So it is a very, at this point, small scale solution.
Well, enter Governor Tina Kotek, right? Governor Kotek has really prioritized housing in her first 2 years in office. How does the community land trust model fit into those plans?
Yeah. So one of the reasons that I really like having written about the community land trust is because it uses money from what's called the Local Innovation and Fast Track program. This is a taxpayer subsidy program that state lawmakers have dumped hundreds of millions of dollars into. It's one of our main subsidy programs to pay for affordable housing in Oregon. It's also been around for about a decade, and Governor Kotek is asking lawmakers to put about $800 million into it this session. So of that, she's proposing sending $700 million to pay for rentals and then $100 million for sale homes. So of that 100 million, some of the money would theoretically go to these land trust homes. The land trust homes have been using LIFT money. So Rooted Homes has been tapping into what's called LIFT homeownership funds over the past few years to build these land trust homes. This is one of the ways that Oregon's investment in taxpayer subsidized housing is playing out on the ground.
Gotcha. The governor's got to set a pretty ambitious goal that you've chronicled really well of building 36,000 homes a year. I know you've written about the push to expand so-called middle housing, for example. Tell us a little bit about that and about some of the other ways the governor is trying to meet this goal.
Yeah. Middle housing is things like townhomes, duplexes, triplexes. Kotek has a bill before the legislature this year that builds upon a bill she championed as House Speaker in 2019 that effectively legalized putting those kinds of missing middle homes in areas where single family homes traditionally dominated. And so missing middle housing is viewed as basically one option to expand housing supply. Like CLTs, and I think Kotek would say this too, it's about adding more options to the menu. Kotek has said that with middle housing, and she's a big booster of middle housing, this is about choice. It's about adding more tools to the toolbox, which is, a big housing wonk cliche. So like CLTs, it's about having a range of options.
So speaking of that 36,000 new builds a year, It feels unlikely that Oregon will hit that target, even with innovations like the ones you're telling us about, expanding community land trusts and building more missing middle housing. So, what's standing in the state's way? Why is this so hard?
Yeah, it's a lot of factors are standing in the state's way. The national picture has been pretty bleak in terms of the economy for home builders with high interest rates and other factors, despite, uh, you know, there's only so much state government can do. And we have fallen pretty far short of the 36,000 goal. The permits have not aligned with the governor's goal, even remotely. Um, so, we wrote a story last year, basically showing that a forecast shows in the governor's own budget shows that even into the next decade, you know, it doesn't even look like we're going to hit, 36,000 units on an annual basis.
Okay. Well, not to make this even more of a stressful conversation, but does the Trump administration potential actions impact that goal further?
The actions that the Trump administration has signaled going into the White House do stand to impact housing in Oregon. One big thing that Trump has signaled is the mass deportations. Um, Migrants make up a large portion of the residential construction workforce. So I think that builders are pretty worried about, you know, their workforce, and at a time when labor costs are high and we need you need folks to build houses, that's going to add another strain on the industry. There's also, as we saw last week with the federal funding freeze, and then his administration rescinding the memo, but then lots of uncertainty. I was emailing with Oregon Housing and Community Services to seek some clarification on how that would affect us, as well as what are known as private activity bonds, which are a key funding source for Oregon affordable housing. There are a lot of unknowns and concerns / uncertainties about how this presidential administration's moves on affordable housing funding will affect Oregon.
Oh boy. Okay, well, on that cheerful note, let's take us back to Bend for just a second. Is and the site of your community land trust housing story. Is there anything about that I didn't ask you about that you'd really like listeners to know or take with them when they think about these options?
I have known Jackie Keogh, who's the executive director of Rooted Homes, for a few years now, and we've been chatting about the CLT model for a few years now. Going out to see the Rooted Homes was it was interesting to see the developments up close and see a direct line from the taxpayer funds to actual developments.
Yeah. I think that's great. It is really often that we write about things in theory, and it's great to see them on the ground in practice. Jonathan, just before we let you go, I wanted to switch gears a little bit. The other part of your beat is covering commercial real estate. That means you are the reporter who knows if we're finally getting a Uniqlo in Oregon, maybe, who can say? What are some of the commercial real estate deals you're keeping a close eye on in 2025?
I mean, the big one is the James Beard public market. I'm super excited to see how that goes.
Me
Um,
too.
just in terms of, as somebody who walks around downtown a lot on my lunch breaks, I'm very curious to see how that plays out. They are slated for a partial opening in 2025, so later this year, and then they're going for a full opening in 2026. I spoke with their executive director earlier this month when they purchased one of the 2 buildings that they're slated to occupy. And the leader just described for me a lot of the food stalls and goods that they'll have on offer. And, they're going to have a butcher and a fishmonger and, cheese and wine and all kinds of things that, not to bring up the Seattle equivalent up in that other state, but it sounds like it'll be a really interesting offering for Portlanders.
Like the ferry building in San Francisco, right? If listeners have ever been down there. I
Right.
mean, I gotta say, I have in other jobs and in other places, I've written about the James Beard Public Market too. I never thought it would really happen, just because it's been a project that's been in development for so long. They've had like 5 or 6 possible locations. But when you really think about it, it makes a lot of sense for Portland, which is a city that kind of staked its reputation, its national profile on food and wine and general deliciousness. So
Yeah.
that is pretty cool. I'm excited to see that too. Anything else that's on your radar screen?
According to one real estate brokerage, JLL, there are reportedly some tenants in the market, as they say in the industry, the office market. So I'm keeping my eye out for those to see if there are any big leases downtown that are signed. So we're always on the lookout for those. And then obviously, in terms of folks who are leaving, US Bank, we've reported that. Hoffman Construction is on its way out if they haven't left already for Lake Oswego. So it's just sort of some churn that we're working through in the office market.
Are we getting this baseball stadium?
That's a great question. We'll see.
Zidell
Yards.
I don't know, it'd be pretty fun to take the train down to see some baseball on a summer evening. All right, well, we'll leave it there. This has been really fascinating. Thank you so much for your time today, Jonathan. I will drop links to Jonathan's Sunday story on community land trusts and other relevant stories in the show notes, where you can read more about housing affordability and what it means for our region. With that, I'll call it a wrap. Thank you so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like the show, give us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help people find the show. And tell your friends, help spread the word. But I gotta say, the best way to support our journalism and stories like Jonathan's terrific piece is with a subscription to the Oregonian and Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/podsupport. Until next time.